Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, and this evening I'm going to be doing a little talk about the recent event of the shooting of Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords down in Arizona, and I'm going to be covering the topic of spiritual warfare and also political warfare, because both of these essentially tie into this event. I've made several videos on this previously on my other channel, and much of the video was based on speculative matters, particularly what the motivations were behind the crime. At first there were some oddities surrounding the relationship between Mr. Loughner's channel and the Congresswoman's channel. She is in fact subscribed to his channel, and there have also been media reports covering that there had been a 3-year period in which the perpetrator was actually stalking the Congresswoman, and that he had previously done some form of campaign work for her. Now, the interesting connection that I wanted to talk about is one that I don't think many people are talking about, and I don't think even those who are talking about it are treating it the right way. Now, I consider myself a member of the truth movement in the respect that I believe that our government keeps too many secrets from us here in the United States, and that we need a lot more transparency. I have doubts about many events in recent history, including the nature of the 9/11 attacks, and as such I have been drawn to certain videos and certain movements on the internet for purposes of research. One of these has been the Venus Project and or Zeitgeist movement, and this was a movement that Mr. Loughner was also very heavily involved in. My correspondence with this particular group was very brief. It lasted no more than 1 day, and it was essentially me conversing with a few members of the movement and then immediately coming to the conclusion that these people were essentially no good. Just about everybody else on the theistic side of truth politics is diametrically opposed to this movement for many reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that they espouse a rather vile and contemptible form of atheism from a conspiratorial standpoint. I have linked in the description a video that was done, it's a clipping from an ABC report in which a former friend of the perpetrator of this recent and horrendous act was essentially asked a series of questions about the perpetrator's life, essentially what kind of things he was into, and one of the topics that came up was the issue of the Zeitgeist movement. Now, what was interesting about this particular video, and you can chalk this up to mainstream media incompetence or bias, is that they spent a lot of time, basically all of the time, dealing with the Zeitgeist video, talking about the currency issues. Now, from my standpoint, the currency issues, particularly fiat currency and the Federal Reserve System, is one of the things that originally drew me to the documentary. But what the reporter does not get into is the half-hour first chapter of the documentary where the topic of Christianity is at the forefront. Now, I don't think I need to get into the particulars of this documentary because most people that go in Christian conspiratorial areas are already familiar with it. But long story short, the documentary essentially tries to debunk not only the validity of Christ as the only Son of God and the Redeemer of all of us who are sinful but elect in our faith, but in fact it actually challenges his entire existence. It asserts that he was not a real person, that he was simply a fictitious composite of several previous figures in pagan mythology, most particularly Krishna, Dionysus, Osiris, and a couple of others. And there are many videos on YouTube that have done a pretty good job of debunking this video, but I don't think enough attention has been paid to essentially the nature of this overall movement. Zeitgeist as a movement is a very obscure and a very incongruous political movement that essentially somewhat mimics utopian communistic politics. There are some differences between them. Most communistic politics tends to follow the Marxist model, which actually calls for a central bank. Zeitgeist politics actually calls for an out-and-out abolition of all currency use, and they essentially argue it from the standpoint of a technocracy in which the actual technological advancements would essentially make all forms of currency unnecessary, which is logically fallacious, but to somebody who is not well versed in basic economics, I can see how people could be hook, line, and sinkered into this, essentially. Somebody that could be roped in by this particular way of thinking, and I think that's probably what happened in the case of Mr. Loughner. I think that he was a ignorant kid who essentially got roped in by some bad ideas. Now, there is also a strong element within the Zeitgeist movement pertaining to drug usage and transcendental epistemology, essentially the viewpoint that you can alter your perception through hallucinogenic drugs in order to reach higher levels of consciousness. And I'm not going to get into the particulars of that either, but there are some good websites that pretty well lay out essentially what this belief system is, and I've provided a link to one in the description, and you can do a Google search if you want to get some secondary sources on this also, just to further bolster this. Now, there has also been a good amount of talk amongst certain Christian bloggers that they're on the topic of spiritual warfare, and I do concur with them on this particular point. I think when you look at the mugshot of the perpetrator, it becomes very obvious that the person is not merely psychologically deranged, but is in fact of a deviant and malicious nature. You don't see people exhibit the things that were described by people that knew Mr. Loughner and come to the conclusion that he was simply schizophrenic. He had a strong sociopathological tendency as well, something that mimicked such people as Ted Bundy and Richard Loughner and others of that particular persuasion, essentially people that were not only psychotic but also essentially people that were of an insidious nature, people that were essentially vile and despicable, and who essentially perpetrated horrendous acts that were essentially far beyond the pale for somebody who's merely mentally incompetent. This is something entirely different. Trustin JC, whose video I am responding to, he actually does a good talk about the nature of spiritual warfare, and I do think that to some extent the theological disposition of the victims can be looked upon as a motivator on a spiritual level for this event. But in terms of the way that people are treating this, I think that a lot of people are spending too much time focusing on the outward political appearance of this, which is simply fringe politics, and that they are not looking specifically at the particular movement that Mr. Loughner was sucked into. Now, is it true that all those involved in the Zeitgeist movement are psychotic killers? Well, of course, absolutely not. There are thousands of people involved in this movement, and we're not getting thousands of reports of people perpetrating stuff like this. However, this particular movement is fertile grounds for this way of for this sort of person, because the things that they teach are so horrendously anti-logical and irrational that you're going to draw people of this particular mindset. Utopian political movements, by their nature, have been prone to violent events, essentially whenever they gain a foothold in society. And the same can be true for extreme secularistic movements, of which Zeitgeist is an example. They don't outwardly call for violence, however, they do call out for a specific kind of resistance, which I think could lead to violence in certain specific circumstances. And I think that people can take this so far as to come to a point similar to what Jared Loughner came to in his particular case. So to sum all of this up, I think that although the individual people that put together the Zeitgeist movement may not be aware of this, they have essentially put together a work of devilry. I think that the entire Zeitgeist movement is predicated on a fallacious understanding not only of Christianity but also of reality in general. And I think that essentially anybody who is interested in truth, no matter how deep you want to get into it, should avoid this movement. And I definitely think that anybody who has any shred of Christian faith in them should at all costs avoid getting mixed up with these people, because it will not be pretty, trust me. I made my profession of faith open to all of them, and they were very hostile to me, more hostile than even the most dogmatic objectivists that are tied in with the Ayn Rand Institute, and they can be pretty bad as well. So my sentiment on this is essentially the same as that of Trust in JC, and also to an extent with Most Holy Family Monastery, which is a sedevacantist group. I have disagreements with both channels on certain theological issues, but I think in terms of the nature of spiritual warfare, there is definitely something else going on here than mere psychological issues. And I also believe that essentially, in order to be able to prevent something like this happening in the future, we do need to have a discussion as a nation. But this discussion has very little to do with politics and with political rhetoric, and more to do with the decline of our culture and also the decline of our faith. That is essentially my stance on the matter, and I leave it to all of you to respond and to let me know what you think. So until next time, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, God be with you all.